Any questions about mysticism? Somewhat connected to it, in the sense of an emphasis on the emotion, the contemplation, is the development of Devoto Moderna, modern devotion. It too, in some ways, is a religious reform movement focused on developing characteristics like humility and obedience and simplicity of life. These are the kind of things that are encouraged in response to the lavishness of society, especially the church. Starts in the Netherlands, but also becomes popular in Germany. A lot of the core belief is that scholasticism has made the church too rational, and it didn't address the spiritual hunger of the common people. Some of this is developed through the creation of communal houses where people, like-minded people, could gather. Groups like first the Sisters of the Common Life and then later the Brothers of the Common Life develop in a way that it's not quite the parish, right? You're not living in town, and it's not the monastery. You're not taking vows, and so you're kind of living somewhat in between. Also, a lot of monasteries required significant sums of money. So only the rich could be monastics, especially toward the later part of the Middle Ages. Groups like the Sisters or Brothers of Common Life didn't require that. They would provide for themselves by producing goods, textiles, fabrics, other types of those kind of goods, or copying texts. They also were very concerned about the spiritual formation of youth, established schools, etc. Now, on the surface of it, it might seem like, okay, this is a rather interesting little group. Can't be too much of a controversy. Well, not entirely. There were a lot of concerns about groups like these from clergy and from others because the concern is, okay, it sounds like some of these other heretical movements. So is this a heresy as well? Concerns there was a new religious order, like Dominicans or the Franciscans or something like that. New religious orders had been outlawed in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And so if this was a new religious order, it would have been breaking canon law. And then finally, the concerns were, well, they don't take religious vows, so they don't sound like they're monastic. So where do these people fit in with the church? Prayer was very important for these devoted groups, with a lot of the focus on inner devotions instead of the vocal reading or the oral reading of prayers and psalms like you would see in monastic life following the divine office. This is more focused on meditation. Although it still had the methodical nature to it like you would find in monastic prayer life. Certain prayers and certain religious exercises done on certain days that would differ day by day and would differ week by week. Eventually, this style of spirituality would disappear with the Reformation. Part of it had to do with how the Reformation picks up some of these kind of things and how the church is responding in the wake of the Reformation. One of the most influential followers of Devoto Moderna was Thomas Tempus, Thomas from the town of Tempus. Born in Cologne, Germany, he follows his brother into the Brothers of Common Life and will eventually become a priest as well. He will spend much of his life engaging in devotional exercises, writing, copying the Bible. He's said to have copied the Bible at least 4 times. Now again, it might not sound that big of a deal today, but we're talking about before the printing press. He will write a variety of works, including biographies of the founders of Devoto Moderna, as well as sermons and meditations. His most famous work is known as The Imitation of Christ. It is perhaps the most read devotional book in history, except the Bible, if we include that as a devotional book. And no book other than the Bible has been translated into more languages than The Imitation of Christ. Technically, the book is anonymous, but scholars believe there is good reason to attribute it to Thomas. Some of that has to do with attributions at the time, as well as other things within the work itself. In the book, he encourages people to focus on the interior life, which will help resist temptation, will help a person to learn humility. And there's also the encouragement to give up on theology and its arguments, that those arguments and that kind of disputation did not lead to greater spirituality. Silence and solitude are particularly important for Thomas. Few people, he would write, turn to God, and this is not an exact quote, they turn to God because they are misled by the world. So they don't turn to God because of the world, the desires of the flesh, but we should recognize that these things are only temporary and ephemeral. It's the humility, it's the Christian virtues. Those are the things that last. The pinnacle of the work, the last section, is devotion to the Eucharist. Frequent observation of the Eucharist, spending time contemplating and meditating on the Eucharist. As a sacrament, it provides grace and would give strength to the soul and the body. Questions about Devoto Moderni? We also see during this time, the latter part of the Middle Ages, the Pre-Reformation period, a lot of interest in death and suffering. There's a lot of anxiety that people have, particularly about death. Right? You have the Black Death that shows up every couple of years. There's anxiety over famines, warfare, violence. So you would not be surprised that a lot of people spend time thinking about them, talking about them. So you have this culture of uncertainty and fear that led to despair and dread for many people, especially the common people. There are even reports of cannibalism, if everything else wasn't bad enough. We see this in a couple of ways when it comes to Christian practice. One is what's known as the Danse Macabre. So, concerns about death appear in sermons and art, particularly what are known as woodcuts of the time. One of the most popular is the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Death as a skeleton is a dancing figure leading his victims. In artworks such as this, no one can escape death. Usually the pictures included people from a variety of life stages, from classes, different genders, all to express the universality of death. Often they would also include an hourglass. There weren't any on the examples I had here to suggest that your time is running out. So it's a constant kind of representation of death coming for you, being prepared for death, etc. Also popular at the time was the development of the Stations of the Cross, or the Via Crucis, the Way of the Cross. This essentially was meditations and practices related to the sufferings of Jesus. The Stations of the Cross was a popular devotion that developed during the later Middle Ages. It appears like there were some aspects of it that were prior to this point, but the stations combined both physical movement with contemplation or meditation. People moved along various stations in maybe a church building, a cathedral, or in some places along a path where you would stop at different places and meditate on different aspects of Jesus' path from being condemned by Pilate to being laid in the tomb. The number of stations varied for some time until it was finally set at 14. These stations might have been paintings or sculptures and could be found in both inside and outside church buildings. It appears that it probably started somewhere in the later Middle Ages around Jerusalem and then eventually spread to places throughout Europe. The stations were eventually settled on, as I mentioned, in the number 14, and focused on different aspects of those last movements of Jesus. And as you progressed to different stations, you were to meditate about different things. These are more modern pictures of the stations. Right? These are not from the Middle Ages, but I could not find any good images of old stations. So these are the ones that I found. So, for example, in a station like this, the very first one, Jesus is condemned to death. You see Pilate washing his hands, Jesus being let off. You might contemplate the fact that Jesus is condemned to death for you. Right? And you're thinking about what does it mean that Jesus is being condemned in my place. So meditating, praying about that. Before moving on to the next station, where Jesus receives his cross, the third station involves the first of three falls Jesus is said to have taken on the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering that leads to Calvary. After that fall, he encounters his mother, who is, of course, quite distraught over the sentence of her son, and so meditating about Mary, about some of the things that she must be going through, etc. The taking of the cross by Simon. At such a stage, you might meditate on how you would be called to suffer with Christ or to help Christ bear the cross, to bear the cross yourself. And all these kind of things might fit in with what you would like meditate at this station. At the sixth station, Jesus' face is wiped by Veronica. Now, before you can say, I don't remember that part of Scripture, this was a Catholic tradition connected with the woman with the hemorrhage. I remember the story. She's had this bleeding problem for several years, and she reaches out to touch Jesus' garment, believing that if she touches it, she'll be healed, and she is. Later tradition would name her as Veronica, and the claim would be that during the path to Calvary, she would give Christ her veil to wipe the blood off of his face. And then he would return it to her, now bearing the image of Jesus' face. It's kind of an early Shroud of Turin, which also cannot be traced back further than the 14th century. So it's not the Shroud of Turin, but it's a similar type of thing about this image of Christ on a piece of cloth.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so I don't ask them. Do they put the veil that they assume is like some kind of height and state, like, you know, this is the veil that touches Jesus' face?
I don't know. I don't know if the veil was still around, but a lot of those kind of things would have been honored very greatly as relics. These are which is why the shroud, even though the church officially can't say that it is the burial shroud of Jesus, and there have been a lot of questions as to how full the shroud actually is. There's still that level of popular acceptance of these things. So people still line up to see the Shroud of Turin, even though the church has never officially said, and this is the burial cloth of Christ. And so those kind of objects would have this kind of popular acclaim, even if they wouldn't be officially recognized by the church. Jesus would then fall again before meeting the women of Jerusalem who are weeping. He tells them to not weep. He will fall once again before making it to Calvary, where he is stripped of his garments, crucified, dying, his body being taken down, and then usually depicted as being given to Mary, and then finally laid in the tomb. Now, one question that some people have had from Catholics have had is why stop there? Why isn't there resurrection? Right? And why stop at laid in the tomb? That's not the end of the story, right? And so I don't know if good explanation has ever been given for why it stopped there. Just maybe because of the presence of death so much at the time period this is developed, and that the resurrection would be connected more with the Eucharist or with a Sunday service or something like that. It appears that the cross being laid on Jesus, his first fall, his meeting of Mary and Veronica, and his second fall, as well as being laid in the tomb, are the oldest of this series. And that until the number is specifically set at 14. They appear to be the ones that were the most common. Several of those, of course, are not in the Bible. The number of falls, there's no indication that he fell, except maybe we could say, maybe that has to do with the bearing of the cross. But certainly Veronica is not there are other things that, in meeting of Mary along the way, those are some other things that are not present in Scripture.